There's something about being alone in the wilderness that sharpens the senses. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, takes on a different meaning when you're miles away from the nearest person. Out here, you're just another part of the food chain, and nature doesn't care how tough you think you are. I've camped solo before in places that would give most people nightmares, but nothing ever truly rattled me. Until that night by the lake, I had planned this trip for weeks, a weekend getaway to clear my head and escape the daily grind. The lake was supposed to be perfect, secluded, untouched by the noise of civilization, and surrounded by dense forest. It was everything I wanted. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the still water. There wasn't another soul in sight, just me, the trees, and the lake. After setting up my tent close to the water's edge, I built a small fire, gathered enough wood to last through the night, and settled in. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional splash of a fish or the distant call of an owl. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the stars began to emerge, reflected in the glassy surface of the lake. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. It was around that time that I first felt it, an odd sensation, like the air was heavier, thicker somehow. I shrugged it off as nothing more than the weight of solitude. I'd been looking forward to this, after all. No one else around, just me in the wilderness. But as the darkness grew, so did that feeling, a prickling at the back of my neck, an unsettling awareness that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I glanced around the campsite, but the firelight only reached so far, the flickering flames barely penetrating the inky blackness beyond. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches intertwined in a web of shadows. I told myself it was just paranoia. I'd been alone in the wild plenty of times before and had felt this way before. It was natural, a product of isolation, but something about this felt different, more intense, more personal. I tried to ignore it, stoking the fire and focusing on the warmth against the chill of the night air. But no matter how hard I tried, the sensation wouldn't leave me. It was as if someone or something was watching me, just beyond the reach of the light, waiting. By now my nerves were on edge. I needed to do something, anything to shake the feeling. So I grabbed my flashlight and decided to do a quick perimeter check. If I could just convince myself that there was nothing out there, I'd be able to relax. As I stepped away from the fire, the darkness closed in around me, the beam of the flashlight cutting through it in thin, narrow slices. The air was colder here, the ground soft underfoot. I scanned the area, but there was nothing unusual, just the trees, the lake, and the endless dark. But then I saw them, the footprints. They weren't mine. They were too large, too deep, and they circled my campsite in a wide arc, almost as if someone or something had been pacing around just out of sight, watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively shone the flashlight back toward the campfire, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the flicker of flames and the quiet lapping of the lake against the shore. I knelt down, examining the prints more closely. They were odd, long and narrow, with clawed toes, like nothing I'd ever seen before. And they were fresh. Whatever had made them had been here recently, maybe even while I was setting up camp. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I stood up quickly, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. There had to be an explanation, an animal, perhaps. But no animal I knew of had tracks like that, and the way they circled the campsite. It was almost deliberate. I backed away from the footprints, trying to push the rising panic down. I needed to stay calm, rational, but the feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating in its intensity. I scanned the tree line again, the flashlight flickering as I swept it across the forest. Then, just at the edge of the light, I saw movement. A shape, shifting between the trees, there one moment and gone the next. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to focus the beam to catch another glimpse, but there was nothing, just the darkness and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made those footprints was still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to drop my guard. My thoughts raced, trying to figure out what to do, pack up and leave. But the idea of stumbling through the forest in the dark, with something lurking just out of sight, seemed worse. I had no choice. I had to stay. I retreated back to the fire, the warmth doing little to calm my nerves. I added more wood, making the flames leap higher, casting long, jittery shadows across the ground. I sat with my back to the tent, the flashlight in one hand, the other clutching the handle of my knife. Time dragged on, each minute an eternity. The sounds of the night seemed louder now, each rustle of leaves or crack of a branch sending a jolt of fear through me. And always that feeling of being watched, of something unseen just beyond the light, waiting for the right moment. It was around midnight when the noises started. At first, it was subtle, distant, echoing sounds that could have been the wind or an animal moving through the underbrush. But then they grew louder, closer, until they were unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the campsite just beyond the firelight. I held my breath, straining to hear, trying to pinpoint the source. The footsteps would stop, only to start again on the other side of the camp, as if whatever it was testing me, probing for weakness. The fear was almost paralyzing now. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, pinned by an invisible force of terror. Then, out of the darkness, came a low, guttural growl. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, deep and resonant, like the earth itself was growling. It vibrated through the ground, through my bones, freezing me in place. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, the beam shaking in my trembling hand, but the light revealed nothing, just empty space where the sound had come from. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, snapping twigs and crunching leaves underfoot. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Whatever it was coming closer, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape, massive and hunched, moving between the trees. It was impossibly fast, there one moment and gone the next, too quick for me to get a good look. But I knew it was watching me, stalking me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't take it anymore. I scrambled to my feet, the knife clutched in my hand, and backed away toward the lake. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get away from whatever that thing was, but where could I go? The lake was behind me, the forest in front of me, and that thing was somewhere in the dark, circling closer. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence was deafening. I stood there, every muscle tensed, waiting for the next move, but nothing came. The growling had stopped, the footsteps had ceased, and all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. And then, out of the stillness, I heard a whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath of wind, but I heard it clearly, a voice, low and insidious, calling my name. Panic overtook me, and I turned to run, but I stumbled, falling to the ground near the edge of the lake. The flashlight flew from my hand, rolling into the water, its light flickering out as it was swallowed by the dark depths. I was plunged into total darkness, the fire behind me casting only a faint glow against the night. I crawled back toward the camp, desperate to reach the safety of the light, but then I saw them, those strange clawed footprints, fresh and deep, leading away from the campsite and into the woods. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. The footprints didn't just lead into the woods, they led to me. I looked up, and there it was, a creature tall and shadowed, standing at the edge of the firelight. Its form was indistinct, shifting and blending with the darkness, but its eyes were clear, glowing with a malevolent light that pierced the night. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, it was something else, something ancient and hungry, and it had been watching me all along, waiting for me to be truly alone. The creature moved closer, its footsteps silent now, as if it was gliding across the ground. I backed away, my body trembling with fear, but there was nowhere to go. The lake was behind me, the fire in front of me, and the creature was closing in, its eyes locked on mine. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night, disappearing into the void as if it had never existed. The creature reached out, a long shadowy limb extending toward me, and I felt a cold, clammy touch brush against my skin. Everything went black. When I awoke, it was morning. The sun was rising over the lake, the birds were singing, and the world seemed peaceful again. But something was wrong. I was lying on the ground near the water's edge, my tent and campfire nowhere in sight. My clothes were soaked, my skin cold and clammy, and my mind was a blur of fear and confusion. I stood up, looking around, trying to piece together what had happened. But there was nothing, no sign of the creature, no footprints, no evidence that anything had been there at all. It was as if the night had erased itself, leaving only the bright, indifferent morning behind. But I knew it had been real. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt, and as I turned to leave, to get as far away from that cursed place as possible, I saw them. Footprints, leading from the forest to the water's edge. My footprints and something else's. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, speeding away from that lake, away from the memories that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Because I knew deep down that the creature was still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting camper to come along, waiting to watch, to stalk, to strike, and it wouldn't stop until it was satisfied. But the worst part, the part that still keeps me awake at night, I'm not sure it was the first time it had found someone like me, and I'm certain it won't be the last. The fuel gauge was flirting with empty, the needle hovering dangerously close to the red line. I'd been driving for hours, the straight ribbon of highway stretching endlessly in front of me, and the exhaustion was starting to creep it into my bones. My eyes felt like sandpaper, each blink a battle to stay awake. When I finally saw the flickering neon sign for a truck stop up ahead, it felt like a mirage, too good to be true. I signaled and pulled off the highway, the old truck groaning as it slowed down. The road leading into the truck stop was cracked and faded, the paint lines barely visible under the dull glow of the streetlights. As I rolled into the parking lot, I noticed how empty it was. Not a single other truck, car, or soul in sight, just a few dim lights flickering weakly in the darkness. I parked near the entrance, cutting the engine with a sigh of relief. The silence that followed was thick, almost oppressive, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The truck stop looked like any other diner, gas pumps, a convenience store, but there was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The windows of the diner were dark, save for a faint yellow light that barely penetrated the gloom inside. But I was too tired to care. I needed coffee and I needed to top off the tank. Anything else could wait. I stepped out of the cab, the cool night air biting at my skin. The ground crunched under my boots as I walked toward the diner. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the bell above it jingled, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. Inside, the place was almost as dark as it was outside. The light came from a single overhead fixture, casting long shadows that danced across the cracked linoleum floor. A few booths lined the walls, each one occupied by a lone figure, their heads bowed as if in deep concentration on their meals. I walked up to the counter, trying to ignore the way their eyes seemed to follow me, even though their heads didn't move. The waitress, a woman with an impossibly pale face and deep-set eyes, appeared from the back. Her smile was too wide, too fixed, as if it had been painted on. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of any warmth. "Just a coffee," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "And fill up on pump 3. She nodded, not breaking eye contact as she turned to pour the coffee. The liquid steamed as it hit the cup, but it smelled faintly burnt, like it had been sitting on the burner for far too long. Still, I took it gratefully when she handed it to me, eager to get out of there. "That'll be all?" she asked, her eyes boring into mine. "Yeah, thanks," I muttered, slapping a few bills on the counter. I didn't bother waiting for change. I just wanted to get back to the safety of my truck. As I walked back outside, the air felt thicker, more oppressive, like the night was closing in around me. I glanced over my shoulder, feeling the weight of those eyes from inside the diner still on me, even through the walls. I hurried to the pump and started filling the tank. The nozzle clicked once, twice, but the fuel flowed sluggishly, as if the pump itself was struggling to keep up. I kept glancing around, my nerves on edge. The parking lot seemed darker now, the lights flickering more erratically, casting the truck stop in and out of shadow. Finally, the tank was full, and I replaced the nozzle, my hands shaking slightly. I climbed back into the cab and slammed the door shut, the small space feeling like a sanctuary. I just needed to get out of here, back on the road, away from whatever weirdness was going on at this place. I turned the key in the ignition, but instead of the comforting rumble of the engine, I was met with a sputtering cough, and then silence. My heart skipped a beat. I tried again, but the truck wouldn't start. It was dead. The dashboard lights flickered weakly before going dark. Panic began to bubble up inside me. I looked out the windshield, hoping to see something, anything, that would make sense. But the truck stop was different now. The buildings seemed to have shifted, the angles all wrong, like a funhouse reflection. The diner was still there, but the walls were moving, twisting inward, the windows narrowing into slits. And the patrons, they were outside now, standing in a loose circle around my truck, their bodies still, but their faces, oh God, their faces. They were grotesque, stretched and distorted, like something out of a nightmare. Their eyes were too large, too dark, and they were all staring at me. I fumbled for the door handle, but my hands were slick with sweat. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as the walls of the diner crept closer, the lights flickering faster, casting the figures outside in a strobe-like effect. They began to move, shuffling toward the truck, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. I tried the ignition again, desperation driving me, but the truck was completely dead. No power, no escape. The windows began to fog up from the inside, and I realized with a start that the air was growing colder, my breath coming out in visible puffs. The figures were closer now, their distorted faces pressed up against the glass, their hands tapping, no, scratching at the windows. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard, reverberating in the small space of the cab. I pressed myself back against the seat, every instinct screaming to run, to fight, but there was nowhere to go. And then the truck began to shrink. The cab, once spacious, was closing in on me, the walls inching closer, the ceiling lowering. I could barely move now, my knees pressed against the steering wheel, my head ducked to avoid hitting the roof. The figures outside seemed to grow larger as the truck shrank, their clawed hands scraping against the metal, the sound intensifying until it was all I could hear. I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up, to escape this nightmare, but when I opened them again, I wasn't in the truck anymore. I was in the diner, seated in one of the booths, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and rot. The walls were still moving, undulating like something alive, the lights flickering overhead. Across from me the waitress stood, her too wide smile still fixed in place, but her eyes, those hollow black eyes, were locked onto mine. Behind her the other patrons sat, their heads still bowed, but I could see their eyes now, rolling in their sockets, watching me. I tried to move, but I was stuck, rooted to the spot. My limbs felt heavy, as if they were weighed down by something invisible, something that pulsed and writhed just beneath the surface of my skin. The waitress leaned in closer, her face inches from mine. "Welcome to the family," she whispered, her breath cold against my cheek. "You'll never leave." I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. All I could do was sit there, the darkness closing in around me as the walls of the diner crept closer and closer, until there was nothing left but the flicker of the dying light and the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was in the darkness, minutes, hours, days. Time had no meaning there. But when I finally opened my eyes again, I was back in the booth, my hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The waitress was gone, but the other patrons remained, their eyes locked on their meals, their faces hidden in shadow. I tried to stand, but I couldn't move. My body was no longer my own, my mind trapped in a prison of flesh and bone. I was just another patron now, another lost soul, condemned to sit in that cursed diner for eternity. Outside, the truck stop waited, empty and silent, a beacon in the night for the next poor soul who would wander in, looking for a break, looking for a place to rest. But there is no rest here, only the endless night, and the darkness that consumes all who enter. And now I am part of it. It was supposed to be just another summer adventure, an excuse to get away from the city, to bask in the sun, and enjoy the freedom of a remote beach with a group of friends, the kind of trip where you could leave your worries behind and get lost in the simplicity of nature. But nothing about that summer turned out as we expected. What we found at that secluded beach was something ancient, something malevolent, and it's taken me until now to gather the courage to write about it. There were 5 of us, me, Julia, Mark, Lisa, and Andrew. We'd been friends since college, bound together by a love of exploration and a shared skepticism of the supernatural. So when Mark suggested we visit the beach known for its eerie disappearances, we all laughed it off as a fun, spooky challenge. After all, who really believes in ghost stories anymore? The beach was off the beaten path, nestled along a remote stretch of coastline, far from the usual tourist spots. We had to hike through dense woods to get there, following a barely visible trail that seemed to grow fainter the deeper we went. It was as if the forest itself didn't want us to find the beach. When we finally emerged from the trees, the sight that greeted us was breathtaking. Golden sand stretching out for miles, the waves lapping gently at the shore. And not a soul in sight. It was perfect, untouched by the usual trappings of modern life. But there was something else too, something we couldn't quite put our finger on. A feeling that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Julia said, shading her eyes as she looked out at the horizon. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Perfect place for some randar." We set up our tents just beyond the dunes, close enough to the water to enjoy the view but far enough inland to avoid the tide. It was mid-afternoon by the time we were settled, and the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the sand. Mark, ever the thrill-seeker, was the first to mention the legend. "So, who's up for some ghost hunting?" Lisa rolled her eyes. "There are no ghosts, Mark. Just stories made up to scare tourists." "Maybe," he grinned, "but we should still check it out. Who knows? We might find something interesting." We agreed, mostly out of a sense of adventure and a desire to prove that the legend was nothing more than local folklore. After all, people didn't just vanish into thin air, right? There had to be a rational explanation for the disappearances. We spent the afternoon exploring the beach, wandering along the shore and combing through the dunes. It was Julia who found the first clue, a faded backpack half buried in the sand. It looked old, the fabric worn and frayed as if it had been there for years. Inside we found nothing but sand and a few shells, but the sight of it was unsettling. Someone had left it behind, someone who had never come back for it. "Probably just a camper who forgot it," Andrew said. But there was an edge to his voice that suggested he didn't quite believe his own words. We pressed on, and as the day wore on we found more remnants, an old pair of sunglasses, a sun-bleached towel, a single flip-flop, all of them half buried, as if the beach was slowly swallowing them up. And then there were the symbols. Lisa was the one who spotted the first one, carved into a piece of driftwood that had washed ashore. It was a strange looping design, almost like a spiral, but with jagged edges, the lines deep and precise. None of us could make sense of it. "What do you think it means?" Julia asked, tracing the carving with her finger. "No idea," Mark said, frowning. "Maybe it's some kind of tribal marking." "Or a warning," I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else. We found more symbols as we continued our search, each one carved into driftwood or etched into the rocks along the shore. They all shared the same unsettling design, and each time we found one, the feeling of unease grew stronger. It was as if the beach itself was trying to tell us something we didn't want to hear. By the time the sun began to set, we were all on edge. The air seemed to grow heavier, the breeze carrying with it a faint sound that none of us could quite place. It was like a whisper, just at the edge of hearing, carried by the wind and mingling with the rustle of the dunes. "Do you guys hear that?" Andrew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Lisa replied, her eyes darting nervously around. "The whispers," he said, his face pale. "It's like someone's trying to talk to us." We all fell silent, straining to listen. And then I heard it too, a soft, murmuring sound, like voices carried on the wind, just beyond the dunes. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, and it was growing louder. "We should go back to camp," Julia said, her voice trembling. "This isn't fun anymore." None of us argued. We turned and hurried back toward our tents, but as we moved, the whispers seemed to follow us, growing louder with each step. The sky was darkening, the sun dipping below the horizon, and with it came the shadows, long, stretching shadows that seemed to move on their own. When we reached the camp, we found it exactly as we'd left it, but the sense of unease had grown into full-blown fear. The whispers were all around us now, an incessant murmur that seemed to come from the very sand beneath our feet. "What the hell is happening?" Mark demanded, his bravado from earlier completely gone. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding in my chest, "but we need to leave now." We quickly packed our things, shoving everything into our bags with shaking hands. But as we worked, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was like 1,000 voices all speaking at once, their words unintelligible, but filled with a desperate urgency. And then we saw them. Shadowy figures just beyond the dunes, barely visible in the fading light. At first I thought they were tricks of the light, but as the whispers intensified, the figures became clearer, more defined. They were tall, thin, their bodies shifting and flickering like shadows cast by a dying fire, and they were moving toward us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Julia's arm and pulling her toward the path that led back to the woods. We bolted, sprinting across the sand, the shadows following us, growing closer with each step. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo inside my skull, drowning out everything else. We reached the edge of the woods, but as we plunged into the trees, I realized that Mark was no longer with us. I skidded to a halt, looking back toward the beach. "Mark!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the whispers. I saw him, standing on the sand, staring at the figures as they surrounded him. He didn't move, didn't even seem to notice us calling out to him. The shadows closed in, their forms merging together until they were one with the darkness. And then he was gone. "Mark!" Julia screamed, but I grabbed her, pulling her deeper into the woods. "We can't help him," I said, choking on the words. "We have to go." We ran, the whispers following us, growing fainter as we put distance between ourselves and the beach. But the fear remained, gnawing at me, filling me with a dread that I couldn't shake. We didn't stop until we reached the car, our breath coming in ragged gasps, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and terror. We drove away in silence, the beach receding into the distance, but the memory of what we had seen clung to us like a second skin. We never spoke of it again, not to each other, not to anyone. There was nothing we could say, nothing that would make sense of what had happened. But even now, in the dead of night, I hear the whispers, faint and distant, carried on the wind, just beyond the edge of hearing. They're calling me back to the beach, back to the place where the shadows wait. And I know deep down that one day I'll return, because the beach isn't just a place, it's a hunger, a malevolence that will never let us go. And it's only a matter of time before it claims us all.